So this week's Church of the Week is St Edmund's Church in Phalange in Greater Manchester, which is just by Rochdale. It's in Rochdale, basically. But first of all, I'd just like to thank Ecclesiastical Insurance for sponsoring Church of the Week and for their support of the lunchtime lectures in general. So this church is actually exceptional. We have nothing else like it in our collection, really, and I've never seen anything else like this building before. It's Grade 1 listed, and it is referred to by Pevsner as being a total concept as exotic as the Roslin Chapel in Scotland. It is, of course, St Edmund's Church, Rochdale, or Phalange, as we call it, which was built between 1870 and 1873 at the great expense of the industrialist and banker Albert Royds. But we'll talk more about him soon. The church is dedicated to St Edmund, the king and martyr, who today you're going to be learning a lot more about. And here inside the church can be found the crest of St Edmund, a crown and arrows. Not only is St Edmund's a Gothic revival gem, but it's also a church full, both inside and out, of Masonic symbolism. Pevsner again calls St Edmund's Rochdale's temple to Freemasonry. This is because St Edmund was commissioned by Albert Royds, as we said before. He was very much a Mason. Now, Rochdale has other parish churches with Masonic symbolism, but nothing is anywhere on this scale. St Edmund's really is unique. On the right of your screen, you can see the lectern of the church, and notice there that you can see the symbolism of the Masons, the compasses, etc., and the square. And the three pillars, for example, look at the bases, you'll see that each of the symbolic tools of the stonemasons depicted. The church was built during a period when Freemasonry was at an all-time high in Rochdale, and its members were literally pillars of the community. Architects James Medland and Henry Taylor designed the church. The symbolism goes beyond architecture to the very position of the church in the Rochdale landscape. Sitting on a diamond-shaped churchyard at the highest point of town, it is making an overt reference to the temple which dominated Jerusalem, casting Rochdale, as I'm sure you agree, as the New Jerusalem. Here can be, this is basically the chancel of the church that you can see in this photograph. The hammer beam roof that springs from the walls is decorated with, yet you've guessed it, more Masonic symbols, this time in the form of pomegranates, lilies, and water lilies. It really is something to behold. This photo is a good photo, but you have to stand in the building to really get a sense of what you're looking at here. There's some beautiful stained glass in this church too, and here are famous scenes that you'll recognise for those of you who are au fait with this from the Garden of Eden. Curiously note the face of the devil tempting Eve, there, if you can see it. St Edmunds closed for regular worship in 2007, and in 2012 it came into the church's Conservation Trust care, and in 2013 we embarked on a programme of conservation work using skilled people to conserve the heritage of this quite remarkable and unique church building. It is absolute corker and utterly bizarre, and there's nothing else like it that I've seen. I'm sure other people have, but excuse me. Over to you, George.
Thank you so much, Peter. So everyone, that was Church of the Week, and that was St Edmund's Church at Phalange, or as Peter said, Rochdale, which is in Greater Manchester. Highly recommend that you go and pay that church a visit if you're able to. I think it might be temporarily closed at the moment while we're getting COVID-19 secure measures in place to reopen it. But that's a church that I'm hoping to get to next year and make some films at. There's some really fantastic volunteers there and members of the community who keep that church open, and they've got some fantastic ideas. So I'm looking forward to working with them next year. Peter, so yesterday, not only did we announce our new platform, but we got some really fantastic news from your neck of the woods, didn't we, in Northampton, about one of our churches, or should I say a site right next to one of the churches. Did you want to tell everyone some of the good news?
Well, after a very long time, we have finally got planning permission and listed building consent for the works to the old Black Lion pub in Northampton. For those of you who don't know this project, and ask what on earth is the church's Conservation Trust doing getting listed building consent and planning permission for a pub? Well, first of all, why not? The second point is that actually it sits right next to one of our finest churches, a Norman masterpiece called St Peter's, Northampton. It bounds the churchyard, and we've been working on a project for about 7 years, trying to secure the future of this pub so that it can work in combination with the church, so that the church has got something to keep it open and can be used for events as well. We're going to turn this pub into a pub and run it as a pub, which we think is a good way forward. It regenerates this part of the town and really the heritage gateway into Northampton. The building itself is a Grade 2 listed building. Although if you go down in the beer cellar, there's some very large pieces of masonry, and we're wondering whether either those bits of masonry might have come from the castle or whether there's actually an earlier structure to this site. It could be quite an interesting site to look into more. But we'll be bringing back to life this pub, investing a considerable amount of money thanks to the National Heritage Lottery Fund, West Northamptonshire Council, and the Architectural Heritage Fund, who've been very supportive of this project all the way through. And we've raised a considerable amount to bring it back into use. But getting planning permission, list of building consent means that we can push on and get the works on site, because we want to get going, because we'll be opening it. We hope to open in 2023. And I've promised just about everybody in the whole world the first pint. So it's going to be an interesting opening event when we finally get there. But really, really good news. And we're very, very happy.
Thank you ever so much for that, Peter. So everyone, will be keeping you posted with updates about this really exciting project. We'll be letting you know about when work gets underway, keeping you updated with photographs, videos, and telling you more about the project. But if you'd like to know more about the project, there is a press release that you can read, and one of my colleagues will post a link to our website where you can learn more about our plans and our exciting regeneration ideas for this church. Now, everyone, thank you for joining us today. Welcome. If this is your first time joining us today, again, a warm welcome to you. Do let us know in the comment section where you are joining us from today. As is always the case, everyone, these lectures are completely free of charge. So if you see anyone comment away with links asking you to watch it elsewhere, please do not click those links. You can only watch them free of charge on our website, on our Facebook page. The recordings are made available, and those recordings are free of charge. You can watch those on Facebook, YouTube, and on our brand new platform that we announced yesterday, cctdigital.com. I'm telling you a little bit more about that in just a moment. But if you enjoy these free lectures, please do consider supporting us. Do like our Facebook page, do follow us on other social media channels, do go and visit our churches. We've got 356 historic churches across the country that would love to be visited by you, but also consider supporting us by becoming a member, but also possibly by also volunteering. Now, if you do want to become a member with us, which we highly recommend, it's a fantastic way of supporting us. Membership starts from just £3.50 a month, and it's a fantastic way of supporting our work, but also coming along on the journey. Now, if you join us by direct debit and use the offer code LECTURE, and that's the word lecture in capitals, at checkout, you will get a free copy of this book written by Dr. Richard Stemp, which is Decoding the Sacred Symbolism of Christianity's Churches and Cathedrals. And it's a great book. For those of you who have already received your free copy, please comment away and let everyone know how good a book this is. As I said, if you join by direct debit and use the offer code LECTURE, you'll get a free copy of this. Now, I hope everyone who's already a member should have by now got their other benefits. So there's other benefits of being a member. And one of them is this amazing thing called Pinnacle. Now you get several of these a year. I think at the moment it's 3 copies a year we're doing, which is a fantastic members magazine. And it tells you all about our work, gives you behind the scenes access to conservation work, and just gives you really up-to-date insight into what we're doing and how you can get involved with us. But as I said yesterday, we announced the launch of CCT Digital, which is a brand new online streaming platform, which is effectively very similar to Netflix, but it's all about churches. The content that we've filmed and that we've produced ourselves, it's been created by people who love and conserve churches. It's created for people like yourselves who love churches and want to learn about them, but at the same time, want to help us and come along the journey in helping us to save more historic churches. As you'll hear on our website, it is predicted that more churches across the country are likely to close for regular worship. And as the leading national charity responsible for caring for historic churches across the country, it does mean that the amount of churches that come to us at the Trust is likely to increase over the coming years. So it's really important that we garner your support and that you dig deep and that you join us, but also go out and visit these churches and get involved with our local communities. So that is enough from me today. One final thing I should say is that we are selling now Christmas cards on our website, and I did have it here, my Christmas card. I'll show you at the end, but you can buy our brand new Christmas cards from our website as well at the moment, along with a calendar, which will be on the website, I believe, tomorrow. But I'm going to pass you over to Peter now, who's going to introduce today's lecture.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much, and good to see you. I was just looking through the chat on the Facebook page. It always is great to hear from all of you people and where you are. I was particularly chuckled at the guy who's at work saying, "Shh, don't tell anybody that I'm working." But you're multitasking and you're learning, so surely that's a good thing. So congratulations to you. And then I was driven by food and beer. So there's someone from Hook Norton that made me think of beer, talking about the pub. There was that, and then someone from Melton Mowbray, which immediately made me think of pork pie. So it is lunchtime. So anyway, I digress. I'm very sorry, but I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Young, who is speaking again for us. You've done several lectures for us, and we're really grateful for the time you've put in, because they've all been corkers. They've been fantastic. He's a historian and folklorist, and authored over 14 books, and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. And the important thing I think today is written extensively on St Edmund and the Abbey in Bury St Edmunds, which is an amazing site if you've never been to see it. So just a big thank you to you, Francis, and thank you for the time and effort you put in. We rely on all of our lecturers giving their time for free and their knowledge to make these lectures work, and we're extremely grateful to you and all those other people who provide these lectures for us. So without further ado, over to you, Francis, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen now so you can see what I'm going to be talking about today. Good afternoon. The subject of this afternoon's lecture is looking at the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds, but the particular angle that I want to take on it this afternoon is to view it in a national context as a great national shrine, a great royal shrine. And so I've called this afternoon's lecture England's Other Westminster Abbey, Bury St Edmunds and its Royal Shrine. And I'm sure these days we're accustomed to think of Westminster Abbey as being a sort of English pantheon, a sort of great institution where we bury or memorialize the great and the good. But at its core, of course, is a great royal shrine. Westminster Abbey is and was first and foremost the shrine church of St Edward the Confessor. But the cult of St Edward the Confessor, the royal saint of the Plantagenet dynasty, is based on an earlier royal cult. And that earlier royal cult was the cult of St Edmund, king and martyr. So not only could we say that Bury St Edmunds is in many ways like Westminster Abbey as being the centre of a great royal shrine, a great royal church, but in many ways it's also the template for what Westminster Abbey became. So when we think of the Abbey of St Edmund, we tend to think of an absolutely gigantic church that existed by the time of the dissolution. This is a reconstruction of what the church might have looked like. It's not particularly accurate, but it dates from the late 19th century. And the one respect in which it is accurate is that it follows the ground plan of that original Abbey church. Now, whether the Abbey church beyond its ground plan look very much like this is open to question, but certainly the basic idea is there. You've got this enormous west front of the Abbey church. You've got a giant west tower going up, a little bit like Ely, but even bigger. And then you've got a crossing tower as well. And around the church, you've got this large Abbey precinct surrounded by a significant defensive wall that's still there. And you've got a ceremonial gateway that's still there, now known as the Norman Tower, which you can see in front of the main Abbey church. Just to the left of that, you've got a small church, the Church of St James, that is now St Edmund's Cathedral. And so that gives you a sense of how huge that original Abbey church was. And then on the right-hand side, on that corner of the precinct, you've got the Church of St Mary, which is now a parish church. However, Bury wasn't always like this, and in fact it wasn't always an abbey. But the one thing that we can say about Bury is that Bury was always, in some sense, royal. Well, the first English king who we can say took an interest in St Edmund's cult, really the moment when Edmund's cult goes national and is more than just a local East Anglian phenomenon, is King Aethelstan. King Aethelstan has, of course, recently been in the news. I don't know whether any of you noticed that he won a big poll on Twitter as to who was the greatest English monarch, run by Tom Holland's Making History podcast. And the final of this poll was between Elizabeth I, who would always probably make it into lists of greatest English monarch, and Aethelstan, who was a bit of a surprising choice. And in a shock victory, Aethelstan managed to unseat Elizabeth I as England's greatest monarch. So Aethelstan, of course, is King of England, at least he is King of England de facto, even if that is not necessarily an entity really that quite exists in its full sense at that point. But one of the things that Aethelstan does is he starts calling himself Rex Anglorum on his coins, King of the English. Now, the only kings who had previously called themselves Rex Anglorum were the kings of the East Angles. And of course, when they called themselves Rex Anglorum, they actually meant kings of the Angles. That is to say, that specific region, that specific people group in Eastern England. But it acquires this rather wider universal significance. So when Aethelstan is calling himself Rex Anglorum on his coinage, it's very likely that he is evoking Edmund. And we know that Aethelstan was interested in Edmund because in around 924, at Aethelstan's court, probably in Winchester, somewhere around that area, which is the heartland at that time of the House of Wessex monarchy. There's an incident that takes place where an old man stands up in King Aethelstan's court and says, "I was Edmund's armor bearer. When I was a young man, I was there in the year 869, on the 20th of November 869, when Edmund was cornered by the Vikings at this royal stronghold of Hegelsdune, somewhere in East Anglia. And I was there when Edmund was tied to a tree and shot full of arrows and his head was cut off. And I witnessed all these things." Now, someone else who was present when this armor bearer was telling the story was a man called Dunstan. Dunstan becomes Abbot of Glastonbury and later Archbishop of Canterbury, becomes one of the major figures of the English Church, and is involved in the great 10th century revival of the English Church. Bear in mind that in large parts of England, the Vikings have been in control for a generation or more. The institutional structure of the church has been destroyed. Monasteries have been destroyed. Dunstan is one of those figures who presides over the reconstruction and the rebirth of the English Church. And Dunstan tells this story many years later, in the 980s, in fact, to another monk called Abbot of Fleury, who's a Frenchman. And Abbot at that point is staying at the Abbey of Ramsey. He writes it down at the request of the monks of Ramsey. "This is my account that I've received from Dunstan, the Archbishop, who in turn received it from the armor bearer who witnessed the death of Edmund." And this becomes the standard text describing the martyrdom of St Edmund. So we know that Aethelstan is interested in Edmund, but we also know that he named his son Edmund. Now, it's true that there were a few members of the royal family of Wessex who were called Edmund before this. So it's possible this is not in any way connected to St Edmund, but personally, I doubt it. I think that it's very likely that you've got some interest within the House of Wessex in Edmund, simply because he's such a tremendously symbolic and important figure for that struggle between the House of Wessex and the Danish rulers of Eastern and Northern England, in the sense that the way it's often presented is that you've got Alfred the Great as the one who achieves the material, temporal victory over the Vikings and stops that Viking advance into England. But there's a sense in which Edmund achieves the spiritual victory over Norse heathendom, in the sense that he gives his life in order to uphold the Christian faith and refuses to give it up, refuses to rule as a client king under a pagan Viking ruler. And so Edmund's contribution, even though he dies, is in the long run just as great as the contribution of Alfred the Great, arguably. And so Athelstan, understandably, is interested in Edmund as this key figure in the formation of an English royal identity, even though Edmund, of course, was never king of England. He is merely the king of this quite small kingdom of East Anglia, which is, you know, Norfolk, Suffolk, and a bit of the Fens. Yet, because he uses this title, Rex Anglorum, he is perceived as this forerunner and patron of the kings of England, and that eventually leads him to become the patron saint of England. So when we talk about Bury as being like Westminster Abbey, well, it's the centre of a specifically royal cult. The kings of England would go on pilgrimage to Bury St Edmunds, almost as a rite of passage. It's almost as important as the rite of coronation itself. It is considered necessary for the kings of England to go on a pilgrimage to Bury St Edmunds. It's also a centre of royal burials, nowhere near as many as Westminster Abbey, but there are a few royal burials in Bury. It's also a site of parliaments, and on occasion, Bury even serves as the monastic buildings serve as a royal palace. If we turn then to Athelstan's son, Edmund I, not of course to be confused with Edmund the Martyr, this is Edmund I of the House of Wessex, King of England, who in 945 makes an interesting grant to the shrine church at Bury St Edmunds. Bury at this point is not yet an abbey. That doesn't happen until the next century. It's merely I suppose we might, in later terms, call it a collegiate church. It's a group of priests who look after a feretory, a kind of above ground shrine, if you like, a sort of bier that contains the supposedly incorrupt body of St Edmund. And Edmund I makes a grant to Bury, which unfortunately is later contaminated by forgery. One of the later abbots of Bury, Abbot Baldwin, in the 11th century, was a tremendously talented forger, very keen on giving his monastery a grander pedigree than it really did. But he did base his forgeries on real documents, and in this case, the document, the latest scholarship suggests that it probably was real, in which Edmund I granted an area around the shrine, which was quite a significant area, which roughly corresponds now to the extent of the town of Bury St Edmunds. And in fact, until 1934, it was the official boundary of the town. The town is now expanded slightly beyond it, but it was marked by 4 crosses and known as the Ban Luca, which is simply a Latin word that means suburbs. And so within that area, the shrine clergy had complete control of everything. They had essentially royal and episcopal authority, in that they would exercise the authority of the king in every respect, and they would exercise ecclesiastical authority in every respect. Now, when it comes to the abbey itself, there is this year, sorry, not this year, next year, 2022, there is a delayed celebration taking place in Bury St Edmunds of the millennium of the foundation of the Benedictine Abbey in Bury St Edmunds. That celebration would have taken place in 2020, but for obvious reasons it couldn't happen. Couldn't happen this year either, but hopefully it will finally happen in 2022. But we know that in around 1020, although we don't have an exact date on it, 1020 is more traditional date, King Canute decides to found a Benedictine Abbey at Bury St Edmunds. Now the monks for Bury may have come from Ramsey, which was the same abbey as Abbey of Fleury belonged to for a period, or they may have come from Ely, they may have come from St Benet's at Holme in Norfolk. We don't know exactly where they came from because there are differing traditions on this, but we do know that by around 1020, a Benedictine monastery has been established. And one of the interesting features is that the foundation date that was celebrated in the calendar of the monastery was the 18th of October. And the 18th of October is also the anniversary of the Battle of Assendoun, which was Canute's great victory over Ethelred the Unready in 1016. And this is very suggestive of the idea that Canute founds the monastery as a thank offering for his victory at the Battle of Assendoun, rather like William I later on founds Battle Abbey as a thank offering for winning the Battle of Hastings. But there's surely also an element of appeasement of God, of expiation of his family's sins in the founding of Bury. Again, we don't have any documentary evidence of this, but I think we can reasonably infer it from this very widespread story that Canut's father, King Sweyn, who never managed to become king of England, but was king of Denmark, invaded England in the hope of seizing the throne, but dies at Gainsborough as if pierced by a lance, and apparently has this vision before he dies in which Edmund appears to him, tells him that he can't tax the people of Bury St Edmunds, and spears him with an invisible lance, and it becomes Edmund's most famous miracle. And as a result of that, Sweyn never becomes king of England, but his son Canute does. And so Canut's got to make up for this, but also by associating himself with Edmund, he associates himself as a Danish king with Englishness. Edmund becomes this symbol of Englishness. Well, we know a little bit about the nature of that monastery that Canute founded. And one of the interesting features of it is that at the heart of it is a rotunda. This is not the rotunda at Bury. Unfortunately, the rotunda at Bury was completely destroyed in 1274 when a later abbot, Simon of Luton, was building a lovely new lady chapel, which would have probably been a lot like the Lady Chapel at Ely. A beautiful building, but unfortunately completely destroyed at dissolution. But he destroyed the foundations of the rotunda, not however without describing them, fortunately. But we do have the foundations of a rotunda at another abbey, and this is at St Augustine's Abbey in Kent, and a very similar kind of structure. And one of the interesting things about the decision to build a round church, a round monastic church, is that it was the typical form taken by imperial tombs. This is the tomb of Charlemagne at Aachen, which is a round church, essentially a mausoleum church, which in turn was based on the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, which was the site of the burial of Constantine the Great. So by placing the feretory, the shrine of St Edmund, in the middle of a rotunda, you're sending a very clear message that Edmund is a representative of imperial power. But you're also sending a clear message that you, the founder of Bury St Edmunds, are also an emperor, that you are somebody who not only exercises royal power, but you exercise imperial power, which in the case of Canute was quite true. I mean, he was king of Denmark, he was king of Norway, he was king of England, he's got control of parts of Ireland as well. He is very much this figure who controls the North Atlantic world during the course of his reign. We'll move on a few years to Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor, as well as eventually receiving a cult that resembled that of St Edmund in many ways, Edward was himself completely devoted to the memory of St Edmund. We know that he made a barefoot pilgrimage to Bury, but most importantly, he was responsible for another major donation to the Abbey of St Edmund. And in addition to King Edmund's donation of that Banluca, what Edward decides is that he's going to give the 8,500 of Suffolk, so the entire western half of Suffolk, what later became the county of West Suffolk, and is broadly the same as the district of West Suffolk today, which had belonged to Edward's mother, Emma. So this important royal patrimony he gives to the Abbey, and it becomes what's known as the Liberty of St Edmund, or the Franchise of Bury, and continues to exist right up into the 19th century as a distinct unit of administration. So that's a major donation, but he also founds a mint at Bury St Edmunds, and the abbot has control of that mint. So that enhances the abbot's ability to exercise regalian rights, that is to say, to exercise essentially royal authority in a number of different areas. But he also appoints a new abbot, and that abbot is a man called Baldwin. Baldwin is, interestingly, a Frenchman. He's the first foreign appointment of an English abbot before the Norman Conquest. This is something which, of course, becomes very common after the Norman Conquest, but is the first person, first foreigner to be appointed to an abbacy before the Conquest. And the reason why he appoints Baldwin is as a reward, because Baldwin had been his personal physician. Baldwin is a significant medical innovator and practitioner, and in fact turned Bury into a major center of medieval medicine. But Baldwin came from the great French abbey of Saint Denis. He'd been the prior of a little cell of Saint Denis in Alsace-Lorraine, but he begins to forge these links between Bury and Saint Denis. In 1081, after the conquest, Baldwin starts building this gigantic basilica. And Bury really quids in with the Norman conquest because it's the only monastic church that's got a French abbot. Not only is he a French abbot, but also he is William the Conqueror's personal physician, as well as being Edward's personal physician. And he also knows the exact details of how Edward the Confessor died and what Edward the Confessor said on his deathbed, which of course concerned the succession to the English throne. So he is somebody who is essentially protected. He cannot be removed from royal councils because he's this crucial figure who's got dirt on the royal family, essentially. And so he is in this unique position amongst the churchmen of Norman England. And so he starts building this gigantic church, which actually turns into, at one point, it is the largest church in Christendom, probably. Certainly, when you look at a ground plan, the only church that was larger than Bury in terms of ground plan was the new St. Peter's Basilica that doesn't start being built until 1516. But of course, we can't say that with certainty because we don't truly know how high this church was, so we can't calculate its volume, but we can estimate. And certainly it was along the same lines as the cathedral at Speyer, for example, in Germany, which is one of the largest Romanesque buildings in existence. Bury was along the same kind of lines, the same size. Certainly it was bigger than Ely, it was bigger than Norwich, which are the churches with which it was competing. I mentioned the link with the Church of Saint Denis, the Abbey of Saint Denis, and I'm sure you'll be aware that Saint Denis is one of the great French royal churches. The thing about the French royal family is that they didn't have a single great royal church in the same way that our royal family today is very much associated with Westminster Abbey. If you don't count St George's Chapel at Windsor, it's very, very much Westminster Abbey that is our royal church. In France, before the French Revolution, you had Notre Dame de Paris, which was occasionally used for French royal coronations, and of course was the church where the king might regularly worship. But primarily it was Chartres that was used for royal coronations, and for royal burials and royal memorials, it was Saint Denis that was the most significant church. So Saint Denis, in some ways, is the Westminster Abbey of France because it's the location of most of the royal burials. But if you go to Saint Denis and down into the crypt, you'll see a series of Romanesque capitals depicting the martyrdom of St Edmund. Not only that, but in the Middle Ages, there was an altar of St Edmund at Saint Denis. And all this is down to Baldwin and the connections that he forged between Bury and Saint Denis. And he also made sure that there was a church of St Denis in Bury St Edmunds, which was eventually replaced by St James's Church, that's now St Edmund's Cathedral. Now, what did St Edmund and Saint Denis have in common? Well, Saint Denis was considered until the arrival of St Louis in the 13th century as being the patron saint of France. You may recall that the battle cry of the French knights in going into battle against the English was Montjoie Saint Denis. Saint Denis is very much the original patron saint of France. Another feature that Saint Denis shared with St Edmund was that they both had their heads cut off. They were both acephalous saints. And to a certain extent, they were cephalophores, that is to say, saints who appear carrying their heads. Although in St Edmund's case, it's never Edmund who carries his own head. He has his own helper to do that, which is the wolf who carries the head of St Edmund. But you've got these peculiar connections, even though St Denis is a bishop, so he's not a royal saint in that sense. But they do have these peculiar connections between them. Well, we might therefore ask, and this is a question that I'll return to later, is why did Bury St Edmunds never quite attain the status of the Abbey of Saint Denis? Why did it not become a royal abbey that was the burial place of all of the kings of England? Why did it not have the major royal burials? But we'll come to that. We'll come back to that question later. One royal burial that did happen at Bury at quite an early stage is that of Alan Rufus, Earl of Richmond. He is one of William the Conqueror's key allies. In fact, he is somebody who did not come from Normandy, he came from Brittany. So he was a Breton nobleman, but a kinsman of William the Conqueror. And he dies in 1093 and is buried in the churchyard at Bury. And eventually there's a petition on his behalf for him to be moved into the Abbey church and given a more honourable burial within the Abbey church. But that's the first time that one of the really kind of first rank of nobility in Norman England is buried at Bury. There are many other royal connections, but from the 12th century, I'll just mention one, which is that Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, becomes deeply attached to St Edmund. One of the places that he visits the most on the few occasions when he's in England. Richard famously didn't spend very much time here, but when he was in England, he would spend a lot of time visiting the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds. One possible interpretation of that is that he felt insecure about his own Englishness. Again, as a French-speaking Norman king or of a French dynasty, he perhaps felt that he didn't have the credentials that he needed as a king of England and felt that Edmund gave him those. But we know that Richard dedicated his crusading fleet to St Edmund, and it's from this really that St Edmund becomes a patron saint of ships and seafarers, accompanying St Nicholas as the patron of seafarers. He also becomes associated with crusades via Richard. And when Richard is victorious over the ruler of Cyprus, a guy called Isaac Comnenus, he captures Isaac's standard and gives it to the shrine of St Edmund. And in fact, the shrine of St Edmund accumulates a few standards. So there's this kind of military cult that's building up around Edmund, who of course was a complete military failure in life, but in death becomes this very powerful figure, largely to do with the legend surrounding Sweyn. Moving on to the 13th and 14th centuries, in the reign of Edward I, it's really that St Edmund comes into his own as a patron of the English royal family. Edward I has a bit of a complicated relationship with St Edmund. To begin with, he actually resents the privileges that Bury St Edmunds enjoys and threatens to take them away. But then he has a dream in which Edmund appears to him and threatens to make him a second Sweyn, in other words, to punish him for his attempt to tax the people of Bury St Edmunds. And so Edward changes his tune pretty quickly, and in fact he goes on pilgrimage to Bury. He decides that he's going to dedicate his Scottish campaign to Edmund in 1296. And because he's constantly going between London and Scotland, on the way he keeps going to Bury St Edmunds. He turns it into a stopping off point. He also holds a couple of parliaments in Bury. And one of the interesting things that happens at those parliaments is that they involve the submission of Welsh princes. And it seems rather pointed that it's at the shrine of the patron saint of the English people that Edward forces the Welsh to submit. And in fact, in the same way that Edmund becomes the patron saint of these wars against the Scots, he becomes the patron saint of wars against the Welsh, because it's this idea of the English triumphing over other peoples. And famously in 1300, the banner of St Edmund is raised above Caerlaverock Castle in the Scottish borders. So you've got this this idea that Edmund is a particular helper of the English against the Scots and the Welsh. Furthermore, Thomas of Brotherton, who is one of Edward's sons, is buried at Bury in 1338. But the king who, above all, we should associate with Bury St Edmunds, who seems to have had the strongest cult of St Edmund, the strongest personal devotion, is Henry VI. Henry VI becomes king at a very young age in 1422, and his father, Henry V, dies young. And he is therefore an infant under the control of uncles who rule as protectors. And it's during this period in 1433, when in fact Henry is just 12 years old, that he turns up at Bury St Edmunds. And the monks sing the great antiphon, Ave Rex Gentis Anglorum, Hail King of the English people, even though it's actually Christmas time, it's not St Edmund's Day. But the antiphon is clearly directed not only to St Edmund, but also towards Henry himself. So there's a sense in which Henry is actually being presented as becoming St Edmund. He has become the great royal martyr. And there's a sense in which Henry identifies himself so strongly with Edmund that he commissions this poem from one of the monks, John Lydgate, which portrays Edmund as this perfect example of chastity, perfect example of virtuous rule, which does seem to be one of the things that Henry VI aspired to, perhaps to his own personal detriment. But anyway, we have here an illumination from the Lives of St Edmund and Fremont, which is that poem by John Lydgate that shows Henry VI, who's portrayed as a child, because he was only 12 years old, in prayer at the beautifully decorated shrine of St Edmund. But he stays there for a very long time. So he arrives on Christmas Eve, 1433, in great splendid procession with all his nobility, and then stays until Easter, 1434. So during that period, Bury becomes a royal palace. He stays in the prior's lodging, which is located behind the Abbey church. And throughout that period, Bury is the center of the kingdom because the king is there. Albeit that he's under the tutelage of uncles, so he's not exactly a king regnant, but nevertheless, the symbolic significance of the king spending quite so much time at Bury is surely very great. Some years later, in 1449, Bury is the location of the last of the parliaments that's held there. Parliaments were quite regularly held at places other than Westminster at this time, although by the middle of the 15th century, things are starting to calm down a bit and parliaments tend to be held more in Westminster than anywhere else. But in 1449, a key parliament takes place. This is at the really the period leading up to the Wars of the Roses. So a very contentious period in English politics. And the parliament passes an act of attainder against one of Henry's uncles, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Now, Humphrey is expected to be attending this parliament, so he arrives in Bury, but in fact he doesn't make it any further than the town gates and ends up dying at St Saviour's Hospital just outside the gates of the town. But nevertheless, the act of attainder is passed and Humphrey is essentially disposed of. So this key moment in the run-up to the Wars of the Roses, which destabilizes the kingdom by removing Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and there's rumors that he's poisoned and so forth. It plays this key role, and it's ironic really that Henry VI, who'd identified himself so strongly with St Edmund, in the sense he comes undone at Bury, because it's as a result of that parliament that the Yorkist party are emboldened to attempt to seize the throne, as they eventually do. Well, the last royal burial to take place at Bury is probably also its most famous, and that's the burial of Mary Tudor, Queen of France, in 1533. Mary Tudor was the youngest sister of Henry VIII, and supposedly the sister that he loved the most. He named his royal flagship the Mary Rose after her. But she was married at the age of 18 to the elderly King of France, and he very shortly thereafter died. So she has the status of Queen Dowager of France, obviously confers a great deal of status on her. But then she secretly marries Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, which is entirely forbidden, and in fact an act of treason for Brandon to marry the king's sister without his permission. They eventually get away with it, but certainly it's a very controversial episode. And as a result of that, she goes to live in Suffolk with Brandon. And so when she dies, the nearest major church is Bury St Edmunds, and so her funeral takes place in that church, and she's buried in a full royal funeral. Not only because she's a senior member of the English royal family, but because she is also the Queen of France. And one of the interesting features of that burial is, of course, that she is eventually moved, because her grave is considered so important. It's moved to St Mary's Church after the dissolution. Henry VIII never visited Bury, one of the very few kings of England between Edward the Confessor and Henry VII not to do so. The last monarch to visit on pilgrimage was Henry VII in 1486. So really the question arises, why didn't Bury survive in the way that Westminster Abbey did? Westminster Abbey, as I'm sure you'll be aware, has this unique status of all English churches, in the sense that it was an abbey church that was not turned permanently into a cathedral, although to complicate matters, it was briefly a cathedral at one point, but it's no longer a cathedral now. It is an abbey church that exists as a royal peculiar. That is to say that it's under the jurisdiction of the Queen. It has its own structure. It's not under the jurisdiction of any bishop. The Dean of Westminster is essentially the person who runs Westminster on behalf of the Crown. Why didn't Bury turn into one of those places? Henry VIII could have easily done it. There's rumours, in fact, that Henry did consider turning Bury into a cathedral on the basis that his sister was buried there. He supposedly turned Peterborough Abbey into a cathedral because his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was buried there, although we don't know whether that's really true, but that's one theory as to why he may have done that. Why didn't he turn Bury into a cathedral? Why didn't he turn Bury into some kind of collegiate church? Why didn't he turn Bury into a royal peculiar of some kind? Well, I think it could have happened, but I think it's important to bear in mind that the cult of St Edmund had declined in significance. The thing about Edward the Confessor is that he was a king who was a bit closer in time to the kings of medieval England. He was somebody that, you know, his tomb was there in Westminster Abbey, very close to the Palace of Westminster and Parliament, you know, visible every day to anybody who went into Westminster Abbey. The cult of St Edmund by this time is starting to wane. It's not such a big thing. I think also the fact that Edmund is supposed to be incorrupt meant that if you're interested in stamping out superstition, as Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell were, then it's not likely to survive, because that's, you know, potentially a problem from a reforming point of view, that the idea you've got an incorrupt saint being venerated. It also doesn't help that it's a Benedictine house, because the Benedictine order is one of the targets of Thomas Cromwell's programme of reform. I think also the fact that Bury is not attached to a royal palace, although it's true that Henry VI did stay there, there isn't a permanent royal palace at Bury. If a permanent royal palace had developed, then it might have been a different story. It might have been that the abbey might have survived in some form as a royal peculiar or a royal chapel of some kind. There was also increasing centralisation of government to Westminster. If you bear in mind, there'd been no parliament at Bury since 1449, so that's almost 100 years by the time of the dissolution. Having said that, of course, Henry does take care to move the body of his sister to St Mary's, so that suggests at least some level of care with regard to preserving the royal legacy of Bury. We also know that the body of St Edmund was hidden and moved somewhere else, and that may have happened with royal connivance, we just don't know. Had Bury become a little bit more like Saint Denis in France earlier on, had there been more of a tradition in England of using multiple churches for great royal ceremonies like coronations and funerals, then maybe the story would have been different. But at quite an early date, certainly by the 13th century, everything becomes so focused on Westminster Abbey that Bury doesn't really have a chance. So those are some of the reasons why I think Bury may not have become like Westminster Abbey, but I hope you'll agree that nevertheless, Bury did in many ways resemble Westminster Abbey, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that it was a kind of English Saint Denis. It becomes this great church associated with a specifically royal saint that is central to the identity of the English royal family throughout the Middle Ages. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francis, for that lecture. That's been fascinating. Thank you for taking everyone around, telling everyone a bit more about St Edmund and the Abbey at Bury St Edmunds. So everyone, we're going into question time. So this is your opportunity to ask Dr. Francis Young your questions. I see there's been some coming in already. But as we said, everyone, at the start of the lecture, this is completely free of charge. A recording is being made, and you'll be able to watch this on catch up, either on Facebook, on YouTube, or on our brand new platform, cctdigital.com. As I said, everyone, if you'd like to become a member with us, and as I said, membership starts from just £3.50 a month. Not only we get a free copy of this book, which is Decoding Sacred Symbolism of Churches and Cathedrals, written by one of our previous lunchtime lecturers, Dr. Richard Stemp. You'll get invitations to our monthly member exclusive lectures, which takes place on the second Monday of the month. But you'll also get access special access to our new streaming platform, cctdigital.com, which launches on Monday, the 6th of December. Now, the very first series that we're launching on that date is with Professor Dermot McCulloch, who's one of the world's leading authorities on the history of Christianity. He's also a fellow person from Suffolk as well, but he's kindly made a series in partnership with us called Church Crawls in Isolation, where we visit 5 churches which have a connection with his life. But that series will be launching on the 6th of December. Then in January, there's another series that's launching, which features Bury St Edmunds, I'm excited to say, but you'll have to keep your eye on our social media for that. That said, if you join us by direct debit, use the offer code lecture in capitals at checkout, you'll get a free copy of this book. Now, I'm going to dive straight in for answer some questions because there's quite a few coming in. Am I correct in saying that there was a bit of dispute in the early days of the Abbey between the monks and a bishop who wanted to make the Abbey his cathedral, and it went all the way to the Pope?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, 2 bishops, Herfast and Herbert de Lozinga, who are both bishops of East Anglia. And one of the things that's unresolved at the time of the Norman conquest is where should the cathedral of East Anglia be sited? In the Anglo-Saxon era, it was more acceptable to have your cathedral in some random place in the middle of nowhere. But that really becomes unacceptable to the Normans. The Normans are far more focused on urbanization. So there's this great push to move these some of these obscure Anglo-Saxon cathedrals, put them in urban centers. And in the case of East Anglia, the place where the cathedral is located at the time of the conquest is Elmham. We don't actually know which Elmham, because there's a North Elmham and a South Elmham, one in Suffolk, one in Norfolk, and there's this famous dispute because there's ruins at both sites and nobody knows which one is which. Yeah, both these 2 bishops, Arfast and Herbert de Lozinga, they moved the see first of all to Thetford, and then they want to move it to Bury on the basis that Baldwin has started building this giant basilica. And so it's kind of a money-saving exercise. Well, if you've already got this massive church, why not turn it into a cathedral? You'd be able to then staff your cathedral with monks, very much part of the English tradition to have a cathedral that's served by monks as a Benedictine minster. You know, great location, slap bang in the middle of your diocese, move it to Bury St Edmunds. But Baldwin is having absolutely none of this, because it means that he will be relegated to the status of cathedral prior. He will lose his privileges. Bury will lose its privileges, one of which is complete exemption from the control of the Bishop of East Anglia. And so Herbert de Lozinga is forced to start building a new cathedral at another urban site, which is Norwich. So that's something which happens in the 1090s, and he has to build that cathedral from scratch. But when you look at the relative proportions of Bury and Norwich, it's clear that this kind of architectural arms race is happening between Herbert de Lozinga and Baldwin. And I'm afraid to say that Baldwin is the one who wins, because when you look at the size, the sheer size of the gigantic crossing piers at Bury, they are some of the largest in Europe. They're much bigger than the ones at Norwich. Although I suppose you could say Herbert de Lozinga had the last laugh because Norwich Cathedral is still standing.
Thank you very much. So it's interesting to say, if the monks hadn't went out there and the Pope sided with the bishop, actually the Abbey at Bury may be still surviving. So another question, and this is I think quite a tough one, is where is St Edmund's body today, do you think?
Well, I have written extensively on this. I've written a book called Edmund in Search of England's Lost King, which goes into detail on the arguments on that. It's pretty clear to me that the body of St Edmund is somewhere within the precinct of the monastery. And the reason for that is that we have a source that was an oral testimony from somebody passed down through their family to the end of the 17th century. That their great-grandfather was a monk who was involved in hiding the body of St Edmund in an iron chest. Now, the source doesn't specify where that took place, but at the time that the monastery was dissolved, there was a bout of plague that was going round. One of the conditions that the commissioners lay on the monks was that they couldn't leave the precinct, so they were all effectively held prisoner, and they wouldn't have been going out anyway because of the plague. And yeah, essentially what I argue in that book is that the most likely location is somewhere very close to the presbytery of the abbey, which is where the shrine was located. So if you're going to take the body of St Edmund out of its shrine, you're probably going to take out the entire wooden coffin, as was the case with St Cuthbert. That's what happened at Durham. That then goes into an iron chest, which is probably one of the muniment chests of the abbey. And then if you've got a gigantic iron chest, you don't want to carry it too far because it's very, very heavy. And the most convenient location would have been the monastic cemetery, which was located at the east end of the abbey. And that's because you had two cemeteries. You had a big public cemetery that's still there, the great churchyard, but you also had the monks' cemetery, and that's where a lot of burials are happening at night because it's a time of plague. Lots of monks are dying of plague. So if you want to discreetly dispose of the body of St Edmund in a reverent way, you're going to take it to your monastic cemetery. Now, that is where tennis courts were later constructed. Those tennis courts have now been removed as of 2020. So we now have a lovely little flower garden in the shape of a labyrinth there. And I am hopeful that some sort of archaeological investigation is going to take place. Well, it probably will be a non-invasive kind of investigation to study the pattern of burials in that area, because of course you've got all the monks buried there. But I believe that the body of St Edmund could be found. And if you want to look at the reasons why I think that that could be possible, buy my book.
Thank you very much. And everyone, we're hoping to have some of Francis' books on sale on our website. I'm very sure to keep an eye on our website. Now, another question I think is quite interesting. Was the Abbey of St Edmundsbury larger than the Abbey at Cluny?
In terms of total buildings, no. In terms of the size of the Abbey Church, quite possibly yes. Yeah, Cluny was absolutely huge. Yeah, the floor area in terms of square footage was certainly larger. But as I say, we just can't be certain with regard to Bury as to whether we can say it's the largest church in Christendom, just because we just don't know how high it was and what the volume was. But yeah, certainly in terms of floor area, it was bigger than the Abbey Church at Cluny.
And was it the case that both the abbot and the monks at the abbey were quite unpopular with the local inhabitants of Bury, and that's why they needed almost a fortification style system surrounding, protecting the abbey church?
Oh yes, absolutely. They absolutely hated the townsfolk, and the townsfolk hated them. I think that the problem was that the town of Bury existed before the abbey came along, and so it was unlike some places where the abbey came first and then the town clustered around it as sort of this service economy. What you've got in Bury is a pre-existing town, and so you've got tension between the sort of the civic authorities and the abbey. And of course, the abbey has these rights to completely control every aspect of the lives of the people of Bury, and yet the people of Bury are becoming wealthy as a result of the pilgrim traffic, as a result of the trade, as a result of the fame of the abbey, and yet they're not able to do things like elect a council, elect a mayor who's got any kind of authority. The merchants are constantly being taxed by the abbey and so forth. And so, yeah, it also explodes into this rebellion in 1327, which is really like a kind of localized civil war. I mean, at one point, it involves siege machinery, and you've got people being killed in such huge numbers. They're just being shoveled into ditches, and the streets running with blood. It's really quite gory what happens. But yeah, there's these periodic disputes between the abbey and the people, and yeah, if you go to Bury today, you'll see the Abbey Gateway, which was built as a direct result of that rebellion, and it's got these arrow slits, loopholes. And these would have originally been concealed behind statues, but because at the Reformation all the statues are taken out, you can now see the loopholes, this sort of sneaky device that the monks can protect themselves. And the other wonderful example of a fortification at Bury is the Abbot's Bridge, which is the weakest point in the precinct wall because it's crossing the River Lark. But it's a wonderful example of a medieval fortified bridge where you've actually got the curtain wall going across the bridge so that the protection is the protection continues. But yeah, it's very much got the feel of a fortified structure even today.
And across England, you'll hear from different places. So I think places like Glastonbury, Canterbury, they say, oh, our abbey was the richest, our abbey was the most important site of pilgrimage. In your opinion, actually, how important was Bury St Edmunds in terms of medieval pilgrimage in England?
Well, if you're looking in terms of wealth, at the time of the dissolution, it was the 5th wealthiest. So it was behind places like Glastonbury and St Albans. But then you have to bear in mind that Bury's land holdings had been declining. Bury had been starting to sell off some of its land holdings. And that was partly because pilgrim income was declining, because the cult of St Edmund, as I mentioned, was not quite as popular as it once had been. So I think it's fair to say that Bury at the time of the dissolution was a bit sort of faded grandeur, really. But even so, it was still, the 5th wealthiest monastery in the country. So, it was so big that even in a time of decline and failure, it was still a force to be reckoned with. I would say that, Bury's height was between, 1065, when Baldwin becomes abbot, and around 1170. And the 1170 is a key date because that's when Thomas Becket is martyred. And Becket really replaces Edmund as the most popular English saint. But I would say that, Edmund is certainly the most popular English saint between 1065 and 1170. So it's really that 12th century period that's the real glory days of the abbey. Edmund carries on being a patron saint of England. Even after St George comes along in 1350. You've got really the 3 major patron saints in the late Middle Ages who often appear together. You've got George, Edward the Confessor, and Edmund. Edmund is always in the mix somewhere. But yes, he's sort of, overshadowed to some extent by these other figures.
And we've had a question put in, why are the coat of arms of the Magna Carta Knights inside St Edmundsbury Cathedral today?
That's because in 1214, the barons, or some of the barons who signed Magna Carta, came to Bury under the auspices of the then abbot, Hugh of Northwold, in order to swear an oath on the high altar that they would force King John to ratify Magna Carta. The old view of this was that it was the barons who signed Magna Carta plus Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and that's why you've got the coat of arms of the Magna Carta barons. The current view is that it did happen, but it wasn't all the Magna Carta barons. It wasn't just a straightforward case of all the barons who then later signed Magna Carta came to Bury. It was a select group of barons, some of whom then went on to sign Magna Carta, some of whom didn't, but all had the same agenda of essentially holding John to account. And this is really down to Hugh of Northwold, who I consider actually to be one of the greatest abbots of Bury. I don't think gets quite the credit that he deserves, but he personally brought John to heel, not so much over Magna Carta, but over the question of his own election as abbot, in that one of the sort of shows of strength between the barons and John was over the election of Hugh of Northwold, who had been ratified by the Pope and elected by the monks, which normally would have been enough. But John says, no, I refuse to recognize you as abbot. And on the same day that John seals Magna Carta, Hugh of Northwold personally accosts him in the meadow at Runnymede and forces him to acknowledge that his election as abbot. So there's that kind of personal involvement of Hugh of Northwold in that event, which is sad, really, that Hugh's role has been forgotten. Because if you go to Bury today, you've got your Magna Carta barons in the cathedral tower. You've got a big plaque on the ruins, but the plaque gives the credit to Stephen Langton, who wasn't even there, and not to Hugh of Northwold.
Thank you for that answer, Francis. And there's so many questions coming in. Another one that's come in. You've mentioned about St George. I'm going to talk about that. Why is there a Star of David on the front of the Abbey gate in Bury?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It used to be thought that it had something to do with Bury's Jewish community, but in fact that's impossible. And the reason being that the Abbey Gate was built in about 1345, and by that time there had been no Jews in England for a good 150 years. So it doesn't have anything to do with Judaism. But it's a very good question as to why it's there, because the Star of David is very much associated with the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And so there's possibly some kind of attempt to evoke the grandeur of the Temple of Solomon going on there. But the real answer is we just don't know why they chose that particular emblem as a decorative feature.
And at Bury, the abbot made a pilgrimage to Rome, and he brought back a relic from Lucca. And there was a chapel dedicated to the Holy Face of Lucca in Bury. Did the cult of St Edmund also travel across Europe, and sort of at the sort of mainland European cathedrals there are, or abbeys there are, other places of pilgrimage or chapels dedicated in St Edmund's memory?
Oh, absolutely, yes. The cult of St Edmund is very much a Europe-wide phenomenon. We've got, well, Lucca is one place where Edmund had a relic and an altar. You've got cult of St Edmund in Toulouse in the south of France. You've got Dijon. You've got cult of St Edmund in Ireland. I've also written a book about the cult of St Edmund in Ireland, as it happens. There's cult of St Edmund in Scandinavia is also very popular, and probably spread to Scandinavia earlier than it spread to France and Italy, for example. Big in Iceland, big in Norway. There was even a church of St Edmund that was consecrated at Damietta in Egypt, which is one of the Crusader churches. So yeah, very, very widespread cult.
And for those of you watching, if anyone, I've said it before, but if you ever go to Lucca, do go to the cathedral, because you can go and see a relic of St Edmunds. So another question is quite important, I suppose, to look at is, you mentioned that Henry VIII never visited the Abbey, but did other people, sort of famous students, maybe like Thomas Wolsey, did they visit the Abbey? Did they have a good relationship with the Abbey?
Wolsey did visit the Abbey. Yeah, Wolsey did have a fairly good relationship with the last abbot of Bury, John Reeve. In fact, John Reeve gets in trouble for the crime of praemunire because he is one of Wolsey's associates when Wolsey is found guilty of praemunire at the end of his life. Although in the end there's insufficient evidence against John Reeve and he's let off. But yes, it does seem that Reeve is involved with Wolsey, which is interesting because Wolsey in the 1520s is engaged in this campaign of dissolving religious houses. We often think of the dissolution as something that happens under Henry VIII in the 1530s, but actually Cardinal Wolsey begins it much earlier because he's got this agenda of establishing this college at Ipswich, which he wants to be the best endowed college ever. And so the way he's going to do that is to dissolve these small religious houses. And it's interesting that, yeah, the Abbot of Bury seems to be supporting that, presumably because it's in the interest of the Abbey of Bury to not have competition, to not have these other monasteries competing for pilgrims, competing for funds. But yes, it seems that, yeah, Wolsey has a good relationship with the abbot.
Thank you so much, Francis. And everyone, thank you so much for your questions today. They've been really interesting. That brings us to the end of our time for today. Next week, we're joined by Dr. Liam Draycott, who's, if you've enjoyed today's lecture about St Edmund, Edmund will be making a reappearance next week because we're going to be talking about competition for the salvation of your soul, where we're going to be looking at patron saints at the time of judgment, so at the last resurrection, saints who may intercede for your soul. And St Edmund is one of the contenders being put forward as, along with Pope Gregory the Great, St Augustine of Canterbury as well. We'll be looking at those three saints next week. So join us at the same time for that free lunchtime lecture. But everyone, thank you so much for joining us today again. Thank you so much, Francis. I said at the start, we're selling Christmas cards. The design, this isn't the card, this is the flyer for it, but this is from Edlesborough. The card there, but there's free designs that you can buy through our website, and proceeds go towards helping us conserve historic churches. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the work of the Trust, we'll post some links in, but do everyone, I encourage you to go and check out cctdigital.com. You won't be able to log in yet, it doesn't launch until the 6th of December, but you can watch some of our previous lectures on there, and you can have a look at the platform. But if you've got any ideas for lectures or any ideas for series that you'd like us to make or explore making, please do let us know. But everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fantastic, and we look forward to seeing you at another future lunchtime lecture from us here at the Church's Conservation Trust. Take care, everyone, and have a great week.